Imagine one day you wake up and you are no longer human. You're a fish. Now this is going to be very startling for you, but you look around and you realize, hey, my water is a nice, clear blue. I like blue water. The temperature feels good. If I have to be a fish, well, this is the way to be a fish. The next day, someone picks you up. They scoop you out of your nice blue water and they put you into green water. Now this teal green water is still very clear, but it's not your normal blue. And you ask the fish in that area, why is your water so green? And they say, what do you mean? It's not so green. This is the way it's supposed to be. The next day, you get scooped up again, and this time you get put into a dark, murky river. And you ask the fish, why is your river so dark? And they say, what do you mean? It's supposed to be this way. And all along, you're just craving your normal blue water. Well, you wake up the next day and you're no longer a fish. But you probably have a really good understanding now of what it feels like to be immersed in different cultures. In this video, we're going to talk about the characteristics of culture and co-cultures. We'll talk about prejudice. In a later video, we'll talk about how cultural differences affect communication. And we'll even talk about ways to improve our intercultural communication overall. So you may be wondering, well, what is culture? And why did I need to think about being a fish? Well, in some ways, culture is like our water. If you were a fish, you may not even realize that you're swimming in water until the water changed. Well, we as humans are immersed in our culture too, and we don't usually realize how immersed we are in our culture until we're put into a new one. If we were going to define culture, it is an established, coherent set of beliefs, attitudes, values, and practices shared by a large group of people. And this comes from Stephen Kornack in his book, Reflect and Relate. But what does that really mean? Well, that we share something with a large group of people. Culture is learned. You didn't come out of the womb knowing what your culture is. Someone had to teach it to you. What's appropriate, what's not appropriate in your culture is all facets that you learn from those who've gone on before you. Keep in mind that culture is also communicated, verbally and even non-verbally. How big you smile, how much eye contact is appropriate, your grammar, I before E except after C. Think about how all those different facets are parts of your culture that's been communicated to you in some way. Also be aware that culture is quite layered. We don't always belong in just one culture. Sometimes we belong in several different cultures at the same time. If we're lucky, then those cultures will mesh well and work along with each other. Sometimes, those cultures will even clash, and we may have to have an internal struggle of what do we do when one part of us is in contrast with another part. And be aware that culture is something that we live. The only reason that culture is so strong, that it can be the water to our fish, is because we live it out every single day. Culture affects what type of food you eat. It affects the type of transportation you use, how you dress, how you talk, even how you think. It's all shaped around culture. And because we live it out every single day, we're not always aware of it, but it's always there in the background. Now remember how I mentioned before that sometimes cultures are layered. That can be based on the fact that some cultures may be co-cultures to another one. What do I mean by that? Well, according to co-cultural communication theory, there's a dominant culture and a co-culture. Dominant culture is pretty much whoever holds the most power within a society. If we look at the US, for example, when it was first founded, the only people who were allowed to vote were land-owning males of European ancestry. That suggests that at this point, those are the people who had power. But even if we fast forward to today, we see that still a lot of Euro-American men still make up the vast majority of Congress or Fortune 500 companies. So we could see this as part of dominant culture. As a rule of thumb, whatever culture is the culture that you associate as the national culture, that's the dominant culture. Then you have the co-cultures. These are those groups who exist within a dominant cultural sphere. So some of those co-cultures can be, for example, in the US, people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ community, different religious minorities. Again, these groups don't hold that much power, but they still exist within the dominant cultural sphere. Now, if you're a part of a co-culture, your co-culture may do some of the following. You may assimilate. In this case, you're really just trying to be accepted into dominant culture by becoming more like dominant culture. This may mean that instead of your normal tacos, you eat hamburgers. Something small, right? But again, by taking on the characteristics of dominant culture, you're more likely to be accepted. Now this has its own set of pros and cons. Keep in mind that yes, when you assimilate, you're more likely to be accepted, but there could still be pressure from loved ones to choose between your culture. Choose the one that you were born with or the one that you originally come from. Then there's accommodation. If a co-culture is accommodated, usually the people in that co-culture are maybe overly polite, or doing whatever they can just to be accepted, so that they don't seem as inferior or troublesome. And then some co-cultures just separate. We can see this happening in the Amish community. The Amish community, a religious minority here in America, is completely separated from the rest of the US. They have their own communities where they still practice their own beliefs of using little to no technology whatsoever. Now when it comes to these co-cultures and how you view different co-cultures as similar to you or not similar to you, it brings up an idea we've already talked about in this course. In-groupers versus out-groupers. Remember, we're more likely to see those who are similar to us, in-groupers, in a positive light, and those who are different from us, out-groupers, in maybe a negative light. While this is not always the case, sometimes it can lead to stereotyping. It can even lead to prejudice. Now, prejudice is a deeply held belief about a particular group. Be aware that prejudice stems from stereotypes. Sometimes the small, little tiny things that you believe about one group can make you think that everyone in that group acts the same way, and that you should always treat people from that group in the same way, based on that stereotype. If we were to look at the stereotype content model, we see that there are different types of prejudice. There can be benevolent prejudice, there can even be hostile prejudice. Now, benevolent prejudice is when someone thinks that a group is inferior, but that the people in that group are pretty friendly and pretty smart. So, we're going to treat them nicely even though we feel bad for them. Now, this will cause feelings of sympathy, but keep in mind it's still a form of prejudice because you still see someone in that group as inferior. Then there's hostile prejudice. This is where someone thinks that the group is inferior and unfriendly and incompetent. And because of that, you may get more hostile versions of how people act out against them. This may be, oh, well, everyone in that group is lazy. Everyone in that group is mean and violent. So if you have prejudiced beliefs, be aware first to empathize. Put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're having prejudice against. How would you feel if you were in that same position? Make sure that you perception check. If you remember from previous chapters, perception checking is really just taking your ideas and values and beliefs and wondering, well, what is the stem of this? Is this an accurate belief? Or could there be other causes that I don't know or don't see influencing this perception? Also, take some time to learn about others. You'd be surprised how much you actually have in common with people once you start to learn more about those other people. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If you don't understand why someone is wearing a certain type of outfit or a certain type of artifact, go ahead, ask questions. Remember to listen actively when they respond to your questions. Try your best to dismiss judgment and purely just pay attention to the message itself. No selective listening, no pseudo-listening, but really focusing on what are they trying to tell me here. And remember to be open. There may be times you encounter someone who is the exact opposite of you, but it can still be a great opportunity to learn. On the other hand, if you've received prejudice, remember try to avoid generalizing a group with that one person's actions. So if you are a man and a woman says, well, all men are weak and I hate men, and you in turn say, well, I hate women, that doesn't make you any better than that person who hurt your feelings in the first place. So make sure that you try your best to realize that one person is the one person with a problem, not the entire group. Remember that prejudice can breed prejudice. It's an ugly cycle. But we are lucky that we have such great historical figures to look up to, like Anne Frank and Martin Luther King, who faced prejudice and still tried to have a positive outlook on life. So, right now, we're not fish. We're just people living in our culture. In the next video, we'll talk about some cultural influences on communication, and we'll also talk about ways that we can increase our intercultural competence.